Welcome back to the Popperian Podcast, the podcast where we look into the life and the work of the philosopher Karl Popper. And today we have an incredibly interesting episode with an incredibly interesting guest. So I, like many people, are an amateur Nietzsche philosopher. I've read all his work and fascinated by him and motivated and gripped by all his work. And for all the years that I've been this amateur reader of Nietzsche, I've been reading this particular guest's work the most and listening to his interviews and lectures online. So it's a rare pleasure for me to have Professor of Philosophy at Birkbeck College, University of London, Ken Jeames. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jed. Thanks very much. And thanks for that kind introduction. Happy to be here.
I meant every word of it. I really have been listening to your work for about 10 years. So the fact that I stumbled onto your work and realized you're this second part of your philosophy. I read somewhere in your an interview you did, you said you almost have a schizophrenic academic life, this split between the philosophy of science and the philosophy of Nietzsche. So just as we start, how does a philosopher of science also find himself studying someone like Nietzsche? They seem to be poles apart.
They are poles apart, and I don't really think one can reconcile them. But look, the reason I liked philosophy of science when I was younger is I thought humans were really messy. And I was interested in Freud as a young man, as a teenager, and I read a lot of Freud. And I thought all this speculation about people's motivation, it just drives me nuts. And I also wondered about the intellectual substances of it. Australians have what they call a strong bullshit detector. I was wondering how much it is just, maybe all hot air. And so I got involved at Sydney University, where people more technically minded in philosophy, to do something very, very technical, because I thought with technical, if you prove a theorem, it's yours for life and no one can take it away from you. And it's got nothing to do with messy human beings. But then later on in life, when I got some bad punches, I had a child who was rather ill. I just couldn't do the technical stuff anymore. I had to do something with flesh and blood people. I didn't want to return to Freud. I thought I like Nietzsche because he does a lot of psychological in-depth analysis of society without the veneer of scientism that Freud had. And, it might just like Freud, it might be questionable, how do you prove this kind of speculation? But at least he's talking about flesh and blood humans. And after this problem with my son, I just couldn't do the technical stuff. I had to be in the world of flesh and blood humans again.
Well, there is no more flesh and blood philosopher than Nietzsche, at least in my opinion here. But before we get into that, so we're going to base most of the discussion around Nietzsche, and we'll make sidetracks into Popper and into your own work, and we'll see how it goes. But we'll base most of it around Nietzsche and how Nietzsche sees truth and meaning and value and things like this. But I must start with a personal story, a story you haven't told me yet. But you had some sort of interaction with Popper back in the day. I don't think you met him personally, but you certainly got on the rude end of a few comments from him.
Yeah, it's a funny story because I did this kind of almost a jokey article. It was only 1.25 pages in the British Journal of Philosophy of Science, because Popper's famous for being anti-induction. So he claims that A having property F, object A having property F, gives you no reason to think B will have property F, right? In fact, even if you had 1,000 things with property F, it gives you no reason to think the next thing will have property F. Most people who like Popper don't even know this. Scientists often say, I get my philosophy from science, from Popper. They have no idea that he has such a strong claim. Anyhow, I did a little proof which actually showed, using probability theory, that that's not true, that the probability of B being F given A being F is higher than the prior probability of B being F absent that evidence. And I left out a little suppressed premise. That is, I'm presuming the probability of A equals B does not equal 0. And Popper went ballistic when he saw this article. And he was at a conference in London with one of my two supervisors. My supervisors were Wes Salmon, officially, and also Clark Glymour. And he was in the elevator with Clark Glymour, and he was fuming about this article. And he said to Clark, not knowing that Clark was my supervisor. He said, Clark, there's some idiot in America, this guy called Ken Jean, who wrote this idiotic article. Do you know anything about him? And Clark said, yeah, he's my student. Yeah.
Well, that story certainly sounds like Popper. And I actually have that article in front of me right now. It's called A Refutation of Popperian Inductive Skepticism, 3 pages long. And I tried to read it in preparation for this podcast. And I have to admit, I couldn't understand a single word of it. It's complex calculus going on there. But I will link it below for anyone who can get their heads around it and have a look in there. But let's jump into Nietzsche. And I might start the same way that I know you like to start your articles and your speeches and all sorts about Nietzsche. I think it's the most important place. So we'll get to the Nietzsche on truth, but I think we need to build up his philosophy a little bit because this will explain where we're coming from. And you always start with this point where Nietzsche is the philosopher of the death of God, which most people have a reference to in their head. But I might get you to start there. And this wonderful... I think it's this parable. I think it's from the Gay Science called The Madman, though I'm sure you don't have it in front of you right now.
Yeah, but I almost know it off by heart. Yeah, it's the Gay Science 125. And it's interesting that it's introduced by a madman, given that Nietzsche went mad. But it's actually important to see that Nietzsche actually doesn't identify with the madman, because what he's pointing out is someone who had the thought that the madman has could easily be driven insane. And the thought he has is to say that we people of the 19th century haven't really appreciated what it means for God to be dead. What happens is this madman comes in the middle of the day with a lantern, a bit like Diogenes, because it's daytime, why do you need a lantern? And he's saying, where is God? I seek God. And the people around him are meant to be like actually Australian village atheists, as we say. And they're all saying, they make fun. It's a big joke to them because I don't believe in God. They said, has he gone on a holiday? Has he emigrated? They're whooping it up. And then he kind of pierces them with these questions. He says, you don't understand. With the death of God, without God, there is no horizon. There is no up or down. Is it day or night? Where is the sun? Who has blotted out the sun? Who has blotted out the horizon? And what he's really getting at is that they think that just because they've given up this ontological belief in God, this omniscient father figure in the sky, or this, or they've given up the notion of the immortal soul, that they've escaped Christianity, they've escaped religion. And what he's trying to point out to them is, no, that is not the essence of religion. The essence of religion, it's not its ontology, what exists and doesn't exist, it's its values. And you guys, though you've given up the ontology of Christianity, no God, no immortal soul, no divine act of creation, you still have the values of Christianity. What are the paramount values of Christianity? The value of compassion and the value of truth. And he says, those are Christian values. So you are still Christian. And here Nietzsche is actually pointing to a trick of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, people like Descartes and their successors, and Kant and their successors, though Descartes and Kant themselves were theists. But the Enlightenment tries to make the big break between themselves and the superstitious, religious, medieval people who took everything on faith. And then say, so what the Enlightenment does is it concentrates on ontology, because it says, well, we're not like them because we don't accept God. This is the modern Enlightenment. As I say, the original Enlighteners actually tended to be theists. We don't believe in God. We don't believe in immortal souls. But Nietzsche says, no, that is not the core of Christianity. Those are just stories, kind of we tell the kids so they'll accept the morality. But the core of Christianity is its morality. And the big break isn't between the medieval times and the Enlightenment times. The big break is between the pagan times, when they didn't have this one omniscient God, this omniscient, benevolent, all-powerful God, and the Christian times. And we are still in Christian times, even though we've given up the ontology because we still accept the morality. And that's why at the end, the people of the marketplace are shocked at what the madman has said, because, they suddenly realize, or they're beginning to realize, that they haven't really appreciated the death of God.
There is a moment.
Answer.
No, great. There's a moment there. I was listening along, and there's a moment towards the end of that, which I think this perhaps is important here. And I might actually read it, if that's all right, this last part. And this is Nietzsche. He says, "I've come too early," he then said. "My time is not yet. The tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars require time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is more distant from them than the most distant stars. And yet they've done it themselves." And this perhaps speaks to, I'm not sure how you see this, but it perhaps speaks to you mentioned earlier, a kind of a Nietzsche as a precursor to Freud, talking about an unconscious kind of not realizing what you're actually doing.
Yes, it's certainly, but it's neither conscious nor unconscious. It doesn't enter their heads at all that their morality is now really up for grabs. And that incredibly prescient of Nietzsche, because Nietzsche says, look, when you lose God, then you lose this categorical imperative that the truth must be held valuable above all. Where is that written in the stars? If I'm religious, well, God tells me to follow the truth. But hey, I don't believe in God. So why is the truth sacrosanct? And so Nietzsche said that, they don't see it yet, what's coming. Well, what's coming, eventually people will say, yeah, exactly. Why should I care about my neighbor? That is, why should I be compassionate? Because, it's a Christian injunction to love your neighbor as yourself. And then they'll say, and why exactly should I care about the truth that much? And so that's incredibly prescient of him to see our current situation in this so-called post-truth era. He saw that coming. He said that is a natural outcome, though he said it might take 200 years for it to happen, that we'll have the full realization of the death of God.
Let's talk what happens in those prior 200 years then, because this is something that I know you speak about a lot, and this is Nietzsche predicts nihilism will flood those next 200 years after the death of God. So I guess I should start and ask exactly what does he mean by nihilism, because this is the kind of word that everyone thinks they know, and yet in some ways it can mean a number of different things with different tones and different tastes to it. But take us to that moment with nihilism, Nietzsche predicting it for Europe.
So God is the one who underpins our values. And Nietzsche says, when we fully understand what not having a God means, we'll start questioning those values. So that's what we might call Dostoevsky nihilism, Dostoevskian nihilism, in the books like The Devils. And Nietzsche had read Dostoevsky. And that's the idea that there are no ultimate values, right? What he wants to say is, look, the ultimate values of truth and compassion have lived on after we've given up God, but pretty soon we're going to see that those values have no underpinning and we're going to question them. Nietzsche scholars, because of the work of Bernard Regenster, a very good Nietzsche scholar, often separate two kinds of nihilism. There's a nihilism of disorientation. That's the Dostoevsky thing. Well, there are no ultimate values. And then there's a nihilism of despair. That is kind of, there are ultimate values, but they cannot be realized. And the reason he did that is because he wanted to explain how people like Schopenhauer can be a nihilist, because Schopenhauer did have a value. He thought what was valuable is happiness, but he just thought it's unrealizable. And so he despaired. But I think we're best to think of nihilism as it applies today as disorientation. That is, that there are no ultimate values. By the way, I have to be careful here about ultimate values. Nietzsche is not saying we don't have any values. That is, we could have values like I value my family, I value my career, but we're lacking values that give existential meaning, that give the whole schmear a meaning, because that's what Christianity does. That's what Marxism does. That's what communism does. But Nietzsche thinks all those great meta-narratives, we just won't believe them. They become unbelievable as we lose God properly.
I might make my first divergence here into Popper then. You said then this idea that people will reject all values around them. And so how would you see this? I say a world where everyone is simply criticizing all things. It has a sort of Popperian tone to it, not just simply rejecting things on face, but certainly the idea of criticizing everything. Everything is up there to be torn down. There's a phrase that Nietzsche, a wonderful rhetorician, and he has this phrase, he says, I am dynamite, and he, trying to destroy everything. So does simply criticism and destruction lead to this, or is it more of a commitment that there will be no positive values to be found ever.
Well, it's interesting because one of the most beautiful things Nietzsche says is, he says, all great things overcome themselves. And he applies that in the genealogy of morals in the third essay to Christianity itself. Because what he says, it's Christianity that, at least in the West, has bred in us this incredible respect for truth. But that very truth, at first it pronounces on the dogmas of Christianity and says there is no God, there is no immortal soul. And then it pronounces on the very value of truth. So he thinks, it's natural for Christianity to, in its natural development, as Christian ideas get taken actually more and more seriously, especially the will to truth, it overcomes itself. But one thing I want to point out is Nietzsche is not in favor of nihilism. He just wants to say this inevitably happens when you truly appreciate the death of God. What he wants is, he wants people to construct their own values. But you're right, he's dynamite. That is, Nietzsche was much better at blowing up things than constructing things. Now, he had his own positive values. He thought what was valuable is great individuals and high cultures. But it tends to be an idiosyncratic value. It's not like he could expect everyone to worship high culture and everyone to value great individuals. And he knew that. So he, in the end, became an incredible elitist, thinking, I just want to preach to a small core few. But this is the problem Nietzsche led us with. Because Nietzsche did not favor nihilism, as I say. He just said it's an inevitable stage we're going to go through. He said it's the history of Europe for the next 200 years. But he wanted to inspire some people to come beyond nihilism. But what you said about, Popper talks about falsification. I think that's what you had in mind, that if you aim to falsify everything, you're left with nothing in the end. And, Maimon and others in the Critique of the Enlightenment in the 19th century already pointed that out. They pointed out, arguing against Kant and others, certain people who were skeptical, and Montaigne to a certain extent too. They said a rampant skepticism leaves you with nothing, especially in the domain of values.
As you're listening, as you're speaking there, my mind was flying around, and I was thinking to myself, I'm assuming that someone on Popper's side would say, except for the things that aren't falsified, which I'm assuming would have Nietzsche saying, Nietzsche has this phrase, we're going to jump ahead slightly here, about truth. And he doesn't think there is truth in some way, or he doesn't think there is an objective truth. I'll actually hand that over to you then and see where we go. Because in some of his writings, I've read a lot of Nietzsche this week, trying to catch up on and refresh my mind. And in some passages, it sounded like he simply didn't believe there was an objective truth there, nothing that would stand up to all that criticism, nothing that would stand up to that falsifiability. And in some ways, he was saying, he seemed to be very Popperian, saying something like, there may be an objective truth, but we never find it, or we never know for sure if we have it.
Yeah, well, remember, Popper talks about something being scientific. It is if it is falsifiable. And Popper does believe in the truth, but according to Popper, we can never know the truth because he doesn't believe in induction. That is, okay, I can know about existential truth. I can know by perception that there's a computer in front of me, but I can't know any universal claim, like say the claim, all planets travel in elliptical orbits. No matter how many individual planets I see traveling in elliptical orbits in how many solar systems, that gives me no reason to believe that the next one will travel in an elliptical orbit, or that all do. So according to Popper, we can't have knowledge. He has a book called Objective Knowledge, but according to him, we can only have knowledge of individual facts and their conjunctions, and we can't have any knowledge of universal claims. That doesn't mean they're not true, it just means they're unknowable. The point about the universal claims is they're falsifiable by one single negative instance. But because he says, no matter how many positive instances, gives us no reason to believe anything about the next instance, we can never have general universal knowledge of universal truths. Nietzsche also believes in truth, but he does believe it's knowable, unlike Popper. Nietzsche, he's not a kind of philosopher who has a theory of truth. When he says those negative things, he's much more a psychologist. He says, those who read me well, read me as a psychologist. And he's talking about the psychology of this obsession with truth. Just to give you a little example, he poo-poos English psychologists. He's thinking of associationists like Reid and Hutchinson and Hume, people he actually never read. He only read about them secondhand because he couldn't read English. And he says, at least they're looking, they got the psychology wrong, but at least they're looking at psychology. And at the end of the first section, I think, of the first essay, The Genealogy and Morals, he says, regarding psychology, but there are such truths. These guys just have missed them. The reason I emphasize that text is to say Nietzsche is not against the notion of truth. That's a misconception. Nietzsche is really questioning why we value truth so much. He's pointing out, and again, to our heads, that's almost impossible to comprehend. Of course you value truth. But Nietzsche, one of the things that's brilliant about Nietzsche, he says, look, in modernity, there's going to be a clash between our need to find the world meaningful and our will to truth, because our will to truth kind of eviscerate all those mythologies that give the world meaning. That is, we need to see the world as enchanted, as having some meaning. But our will to truth says, that's just a piece of propaganda. That's just wishful thinking that there's a God. That's just your values that we should care about, universal happiness, etc. It's not written in the stars that we have to care about that. So all these values are just projections. So our will to truth kind of busts all the mythologies that enchant the world. And once you see that tension between our need to find the world meaningful and a will to truth, you can see, well, maybe we value truth too much if it disenchants the world.
Don't you still need truth, though, in some ways? So as you're speaking there about that, I was again, my mind was ticking over there. But don't you still need truth? So you could perhaps say that if we do away with myth, as Nietzsche was saying, if we do away with myth, we lose meaning in the world in very significant ways. And I think that is probably true historically. But I wonder whether a detachment from truth, or even, I mean, it's hard to say, it's hard to know if Nietzsche is saying that in absolute terms, but a detachment from truth is perhaps an attachment to ignorance. And don't you need truth to make decisions in the world? Don't you need truth to stay alive each day and to do the right functional and rational things?
Okay, Nietzsche is very much for truth. In fact, he's thinking he tells us a story about how Christianity triumphed against pagan values, and he takes that story to at least have some kernel of truth. I think it's more psychological truth than historical truth, but that's a point for Nietzsche scholars. Nietzsche cares about the truth. What he's saying is, but the truth is one value among many. For Nietzsche, it's a very important value. In fact, Nietzsche thinks the stronger you are, the more truth you can take on. And Nietzsche admires people. Like, he admired Schopenhauer because Schopenhauer was an out-and-out atheist when it was at a time when it was not easy to be an atheist. And he admired Schopenhauer for recognizing that truth. There is no God. But what Nietzsche is pointing out is it's one thing to say truth is a value, an important value. It's another thing to say it's a value that must triumph over every other values, that it is an ultimate value before which all other values can be sacrificed. And he thinks that's the mythology of the Enlightenment, that nothing is more valuable than the truth. And Nietzsche says, no, the truth is valuable. And he thinks Nietzsche is a particularly adept at getting at certain psychological truths. So, and there's also the very point you made, that if you didn't care about what was truth, like you didn't care whether arsenic poisoned or it did, you said, I'll accept arsenic is healthy, you'd have as Quine puts it quite nastily, a pathetic but praiseworthy tendency of dying before you reproduce your kind. I don't know where Quine gets the praiseworthy part. Seems to me rather right-wing. But yeah, obviously we've been evolutionarily selected to care for the truth. Those of our ancestors who didn't give a damn, who just believed whatever they wanted to. Oh, that tiger's going to come and lick me and be friendly. They wouldn't have survived long enough to reproduce. So yeah, obviously a minimal concern for truth has been evolutionarily selected, and if we want to survive, we need to keep it. And I'm sure we will keep it, because I think those who don't care a damn about truth will die out. Nietzsche's point is only that why should the value of truth trump all other values?
Does he think
valuable, just not the value that every other value has to be sacrificed to?
You mentioned those British psychologists that Nietzsche was so fond of, and anyone that reads Nietzsche will know that there is so much deep psychology here to get into. How does he value the study of psychology above truth? It's hard to say with Nietzsche, at least from my readings. he tends to have emphasis on things, not because he thinks they're the most important thing, but perhaps because they need the most support or they need the biggest advocate for them. So how does he see the study of psychology? Because with that emphasis he puts on it, I imagine a lot of listeners and Popperians and will think this sounds like a type of psychologism where you're reaching beyond what psychology is and putting it at you're placing a value on it that it probably doesn't deserve.
Well, Nietzsche takes his psychological speculations to have some truth, but I have to say there's something he's more interested in the truth. That is, he's interested in therapy. I mean, in this way, well, Freud claimed to be interested in the truth. God knows what Freud was. Freud was interested in his career as much as anything else. But Freud wanted to claim, A, I've got a therapeutic end, and B, I care about truth. Nietzsche, I think, cared about truth. I think he cared about therapy more because he often says things that he knows to be false, but he thinks they're the appropriate thing to move his audience in a particular way. A famous example is in the Genealogy of Morals. He speculates that the Jews deliberately sacrificed Christ so the idiot Romans would fall for the Christian religion and thereby disarm themselves. The idea is the Jews are this oppressed class in the Roman Empire, and they want to convince the Romans to stop oppressing us. So they put forward this doctrine about Christianity and loving your neighbor, because that'll stop the Romans if they accepted oppressing them. So how do they get these idiot Romans to take the bait? They repudiate one of their own, Jesus, just to make these idiots fall for it. Now Nietzsche doesn't believe that at all, but he's basically, at the time, he's screwing with his German audience, because the Germans of the 19th century had a very, very nebulous sense of identity. Germany only become unified after the Franco-Prussian War, ending in 1871-72. And Southern Germans and Northern Germans barely spoke the same language. They could barely understand each other. Hochdeutsch versus Schwäbische, German from Schwabia. God, how do you say that in English? Anyhow, Southern Germany. They didn't even share a religion. Catholic religion down south, Protestant up north. The one thing that the Germans of the 19th century knew is we're not Jews. And so, and what Nietzsche tells them is, you're dupes of the Jews. The Jews screwed you with their Christianity. Now, he doesn't really believe that, but he thinks it's a way. He wants to tar Christianity, which he thinks is an unhealthy, world-hating religion, with this idea that it's really a Jewish religion. So this is typical Nietzsche. It's a nasty rhetoric, and I don't approve of this rhetoric of what they call Verjudung, Jewification. But he does it not because he thinks it's the truth, but because he thinks it's good therapeutics. And that's something about Nietzsche. He's got therapeutic aims in mind just as much as stating truths. In fact, more in mind, I would say.
That is fascinating there, and I might wind it back to the death of God slightly here. You mentioned just before that quote from Nietzsche: "All great things bring about their own self-overcoming." And he also has this wonderful phrase. He says, "There was only one Christian, and he died on the cross." And I think that first part, it sounds very Popperian. The idea that you create a theory, and then you should go out and attack your own theory and tear it to the ground. So a lot of people think of Nietzsche as this man who hated Christianity. And at least from listening to you and from reading your work, that's not what he was. He actually had a huge amount of respect for Christianity, it seemed. And that's why he spent so much time attacking it. If he didn't respect it so much, he wouldn't have bothered with it.
You're right on all points. And I did bring up that quote, the quotation that all great things perish by their own hand. And I forgot to make the point. And that showed that Nietzsche thinks Christianity is a great thing. So thanks for putting that piece of the puzzle on the table. I admitted to do that. Yes, he respected Christianity. Remember, Nietzsche thinks it's very important for us to find existential meaning. And Christianity gave man existential meaning, Western man, for 2,000 years. In fact, he thinks it's the only thing that gave us meaning in the West for 2,000 years, and he respects it. It's just what he says now is it can no longer do it. It can no longer provide that function. He has really two objections to Christianity. One is it's brought about its own death by stressing the will to truth. But also there's a second objection, and that is he thinks it denigrates life. He thinks Christianity has this idea that this world is just a transitory, temporary world, and the real world is the world to come. And part of that's heaven, afterlife in heaven. And Nietzsche thinks that's a way of denigrating this world, because what the Christian is saying, according to Nietzsche, is he says, you've got to combat your own passions. Like, it's human nature to want to be aggressive towards your neighbor, to have strong sexual interests, etc., to want to dominate, etc. And Christianity says you've got to suppress that part of your nature. So basically, Nietzsche wants to say, look, this is inevitably who we are. This is part of our nature. And Christianity is demanding us to push that down, almost, it's almost like a death wish, because those drives are so strong in us. And so he says, look, really, this is his idea. There are certain people who sometimes found themselves in weak positions in the world. He called them slaves. And they didn't resent their oppressors, the Romans or whoever. They resented their own nature, because their own nature was asking them to do things that they couldn't do, to be dominant, to smite their enemies, etc. They couldn't do any of this because they were so weak. So they don't just resent the enemies, they resent their very own nature. And they invent a religion whereby it's right to resent the part of your nature, because by resenting and repressing that nature, you get the reward in the next life. So Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity is also that he thinks it's anti-life, as opposed to pagan religions. Like, he thinks the Greeks and the Romans, with their gods, were actually celebrating their nature. Like someone like for Achilles, who is Mars to Achilles? He's just like Achilles, only more so. So Achilles, in worshipping Mars, someone who's a great warrior, who's mercurial, who's temperamental, is really projecting himself onto the world and healthily worshipping himself. But to go back to the point you made, yes, he respects Christianity. And in fact, Nietzsche says the person Nietzsche hates the most is not the Christian. There's this famous thing, this, I think, rather poor thought of Nietzsche about what it would be to affirm this world completely. And he said to affirm this world completely would be to wish its eternal reoccurrence, to wish to have it again and again and again. But what makes him say is, one of the things that makes it almost possible for me to wish the world again and again and again, not the Christian, it's someone he calls the last man. And who is the last man? The last man is the person who's given up on the need to existential meaning. He says, I don't care if the whole shebang is meaningless. I just care about my career, my good meals, my corner office, my family. And that is much more despicable for Nietzsche than the Christian, because at least the Christian was in the game of looking for existential meaning. Nietzsche thinks we need to be devoted to be beyond ourselves. And the last man isn't. Whereas the Christian is, he just does it at the price of slandering this world. So yes, he admires Christianity, but he has, A, he thinks its time has come, and B, he thinks he'd like a morality that gave existential meaning, but not at the price of slandering this, the one and only world. And if I just might say one more thing, because you did bring up this beautiful phrase in the Antichrist, there is only one Christian and he died on the cross. Nietzsche has a wonderful image of Jesus. It's not unique to him. There's already some of this in Dostoevsky, in a book called The Idiot, which is this figure of Prince Mishkin, who's a Christ-like figure. And what he wants to say, in what Dostoevsky wanted to say, and what Nietzsche wanted to say, is Christ was unique because he was a person who was free of resentment, and what he was preaching is not that the next world is the real world, the world to come. What Christ was preaching is this world would be heaven on earth if we could overcome our resentment. Why is he an idiot? He's an idiot because he doesn't understand what it's like to be us. Christ was a freak of nature who just never felt resentment. But then he couldn't talk to us because he doesn't know what it's like to be us. Because, I'm sorry, if you kick me, I can't help but want to kick you back. I might not do it. I can't help have resentment. Whereas you could slap Christ. He didn't have resentment. But that's why he's a freak of nature. That's why there was only one of him. Because he didn't understand what it's like to be us, to be fully human.
I can imagine a lot of people listening to this would think to themselves, but isn't there a lot of suffering in Christianity? And they want to have this, if they have any idea of Nietzsche, they must have an idea that Nietzsche deeply values suffering and thinks it is this a positive thing, something that brings meaning to people's lives and adds value to their lives. And isn't there a lot of suffering in Christianity as well?
Actually, no one put this point to me after all these years. But it's a really good point. Nietzsche actually says in the third essay of the genealogy that contra Schopenhauer, he doesn't mention Schopenhauer, that's who he has in mind as much as anyone else. Contra Schopenhauer, the problem of humanity is not the problem of suffering, but the problem of meaning. And he says man will even seek suffering out as long as it provides some meaning. Think of a soldier who's willing to, risk huge suffering, even death, because he thinks it's meaningful, if he thinks the cause is meaningful. So his point is, we humans are not obsessed with overcoming suffering. We're really obsessed with finding meaning. And you're right. Christianity says, look, your suffering has value because it has meaning. Admittedly, it's this false meaning of entering the kingdom of heaven. But yeah, in that sense, Nietzsche is still a religious thinker. If you think what religion is really trying to do is look for existential meaning, Nietzsche's still in the meaning game. That's the problem with the last man. The last man just doesn't give a damn about it. The last man, the good life for him is a life without suffering. Nietzsche thinks that conception of a life is suitable for animals, herd animals, bovines. He says, they just want to be content and chew on their cud. He thinks that for that to be your value, just overcoming suffering, makes man absolutely pathetic and unworthwhile. And there is an agreement with the Christians. The Christians say there is value to your suffering. What Nietzsche says is, look, not that suffering will get you into the kingdom of heaven, but he says, you've got to be aimed for something beyond yourself, whether it's creativity, creating great works of art or whatever. But he says, anyone who takes on a grand project is going to have a fair bit of failure, and they're going to have a fair bit of suffering. So if your value is just to decrease suffering, that would tell you don't take on any grand projects. Don't be overly ambitious. That's one of his objections to Buddhism. He says Buddhism is obsessed with the problem of suffering. But he says, look, I aim to be ambitious, and in my ambitions, I will often fail and I will suffer. And, look at Nietzsche's own life. You could think his life was full of suffering, but by his standards, he had migraines, he had all these medical problems. He had to leave the university, retire very young because of them. He was also kind of pathetic and lonely, and had to pay for his last 6 books to be published. So if you think of terms of what's a good life in terms of absence of suffering, you say, man, he had a crap life. But Nietzsche thinks that is not what a good life is. A good life is aiming for high achievements and coming close to or achieving them. And in that sense, he had a bloody wonderful life because he wrote all these wonderful books. So what Nietzsche is doing is he's questioning, what do you mean by happiness? Aristotle had this term, I have trouble pronouncing it, eudaimonia, and we call it flourishing. And for Aristotle, flourishing is not just feeling, it's not something phenomenological, feeling content. It's actually realizing your talents. Well, that's what Nietzsche's idea of flourishing is, except he's a bloody elitist. Actually, as was Aristotle, and thought most people don't have much talent at all.
Well, so I was going to ask that then. What does he mean by talent exactly? Because some people may think it's something innate, and some people want to say it's something you can. Yeah. So does he think all of us have talents if we work towards a skill, or you could be born with this?
He's bloody elitist. How much nature, how much nurture? Scholars disagree about this. Some people think, he believes a lot of it is nature. I think he thinks it's a combination. I do think he thinks you need to be born with certain prerequisites, but they don't guarantee anything. You also need the right nurture, the right environment. That's part of the reason why he writes the books. He thinks the books might be part of the environment that inspires certain people to try to realize their talents, to not be obsessed with the problem of suffering and alleviating their or other people's suffering, and actually devoting themselves to their talents. But yes, Nietzsche's an extreme elitist. He doesn't even care about philosophy professors. He said people like professors, scholars, they're all very useful in, trying to be obsessed with Nietzsche and get him right, but they are not ends in themselves. The people he cared about, it's a very small circle. In his group of the elect, Beethoven's always on the list, Goethe's always on the list. Surprise, surprise, Nietzsche's always on the list. Wagner was on the list and then he got off the list. But,
was Schopenhauer on that list at some point?
Actually, it's interesting you should say that. But I guess, yes, he really admired Schopenhauer. He did think Schopenhauer was philosophically wrong on several fronts, especially Schopenhauer was one of the people who was obsessed with the problem of suffering. But he admired, as I say, his honest atheism, and he admired the clarity of his writings. And he was very inspired by Schopenhauer, but he was also reacting against Schopenhauer because he said Schopenhauer, actually, remember those people who don't understand the death of God? Well, Schopenhauer's a bit like that, because Schopenhauer's an atheist saying, I don't believe in the existence of God or of immortal souls. But he is still a Christian because he's obsessed with the problem of suffering, because he thinks a lot of Christianity is motivated by trying to answer the problem of suffering by saying, oh, your suffering's okay because it'll be rewarded in the next life. Well, Schopenhauer says it won't be rewarded in the next life, but because he's so obsessed with the problem of suffering, Schopenhauer says the world ought not to be, because the world will always contain a preponderance of suffering. Whereas Nietzsche says, look, Schopenhauer, you're wrong to make suffering the be-all and end-all. There are other things like creativity that are important, and we can tolerate suffering often because it's a necessary condition in achieving things.
You mentioned education, so I haven't forgotten suffering. There's more I want to ask you about. It's so interesting. But you mentioned education and university professors and Nietzsche's low opinion of people in formal education. And I had to jump on that because that's something that Popper spent some of his life talking about. And he talked about the stifling attitude of the university hierarchy. And notoriously, he used to tell a lot of his students who came to the LSE, don't enroll in a formal degree, just hang around and study. So what was it that Nietzsche saw as so damaging? Because the most recent book I'm aware of coming out about Nietzsche was a book maybe about 10 years ago now, but it was on the future of education institutions. I believe that was the title. And it's these series of lectures that Nietzsche did when he was a very young professor at the University of Basel. And even then he's railing against the university. He's railing against this tendency towards specialization. He's railing against, the government pushing economic policy, and economic policy then pushing classes themselves inside the campus. So what was it that Nietzsche hated so much about the university environment? Because again, as you said, he didn't last very long before he dropped out.
It's funny you should say that, because given what's happening in universities today, Nietzsche was around. I mean, I remember thinking, when I was a kid studying at Sydney University, I thought the professors had a pretty cushy life. And I myself, I'm older now, and I got into it when it was changing, but I had a bloody cushy life. But when I see young people getting into academia today, I say, what the hell are you doing? It is so bureaucratized, and everything has to be cookie cutter. Every course has to have the same aims and objectives, and you have to write all this jargony bullshit. But the interesting thing was Nietzsche was already complaining in the 19th century. What he said is, he says, universities are preparing people to be Prussian bureaucrats. And man, is that true now. It's so antithetical to actually real thinking that, as I say, I make fun at Birkbeck because we have for every course, for every lecture, we're meant to give an aim and objective. And I say, just to think that everything has to be uniform like this is teaching our kids, yet this notion of uniformity, of everything has to be put into these little shelves, etc. So Nietzsche was railing against that then. Popper was railing against it. I just make fun of the bureaucrats all the time. By putting in completely bizarre aims and objectives and making fun of the nomenclature. It was already there in the 19th century, but you're also right about the specialization. And this partially has to do with a German notion of what they call Bildung. No one knows how to translate Bildung, the German word Bildung, into English. Some people just use the word education, but they thought education should make someone into a well-rounded person, a cultured person. And Nietzsche thought what universities are doing are turning out what he called cultural Philistines. That is, they may know one thing really well. They might really know Nietzsche, or they might really know a certain part of physics or something, but they don't have a wider perspective. And it was that wider perspective that Nietzsche really valued, because he thought with that wider perspective, you can actually question the larger values of your society. You can spot the values and interrogate the ones that often go without saying, like the idea that everything should be the same size, everything should have the same structure. that kind of stuff. That's Nietzsche wanted us to question those hidden assumptions. And he thought the university education was just turning out specialists who could ask very precise questions in a very small area, but couldn't ask the wider questions.
I'm assuming
Right.
he had a hatred as well for at the very start of this, you spoke about Nietzsche, one of these great individuals who create their own values. I'm assuming he saw the university as perhaps poisoning of, so there is someone born with those talents that Nietzsche appreciates, and someone who's capable of that reevaluation of all values and being that Übermensch, which we haven't mentioned yet. And I'm assuming he thinks the university is going to completely stultify and poison this person.
Well, he sometimes uses language that's strong, but I think his considered opinion should be that, really creative individuals need to think outside of the straitjackets that are provided by universities, the regimented learning. Look, he still respected learning, but he wanted to get beyond the confines of those learnings. And he thought the thing about university is it really forces people into very, very narrow confines. But it's not like he thinks he could be an ignoramus and make something new. It's the usual story. You have to know something pretty well to overcome it. Without that knowledge, you're not going to overcome it. But he thought universities can impart very specific knowledge and not much will to overcome.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologize for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out, and I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. Let's talk about the will to power then, and the will to overcome. That's a great little segue there into there. So I just hand it straight over to you. What is the will to power? Because again, a lot of people may be familiar with Nietzsche. They will know this phrase. They just may not know exactly what it is or what Nietzsche is getting at.
Yeah. Okay. So among Nietzsche scholars, there's a huge divide. There are some who take the will to power very, very seriously, and there are some others who don't. I'm among the don't group. There's a book called The Will to Power, which is a bunch of his notes that he didn't publish, that his sister put together in a book. And certain philosophers, starting from the 20th century philosopher Heidegger, claim that is the real Nietzsche. I think one has to be a bit suspicious of this notion of that will to power is central to Nietzsche's philosophy, because I think really what he cares about is the psychology. And how much the psychology depends on the will to power is really, really questionable. Nietzsche in his text talks a lot about drives, and he does need something like a drive psychology. Like he says, you've got to drive to truth. He actually calls it a will to truth. The reason he picked up on the notion of the German word Wille is because Schopenhauer said everything is will. But the real thing to take from Schopenhauer and from Nietzsche is they're both using the notion of will to belittle our consciousness. That is, they are precursors of Freud. They think our conscious thought is really very much at the behest of things that are beyond our consciousness. In some sense, they're related to Hume. Hume put it a bit differently. He said reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. And he's not so much talking about consciousness and unconsciousness there, though Hume will allow that there are passions that we can have that move us that we're not aware of. What Hume is doing, what Nietzsche is doing, what Schopenhauer is doing, what Freud is doing is they're belittling the importance of that conscious, rational element of us. They say our reason is really being moved by other things. What Freud and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer says, and a lot of those other things we're not even consciously aware of. I think that's a part of the main import of the will to power. And that part, I think, of Nietzsche chimes with a lot of the published work. There are other people who want to say, no, he thought there was a fundamental force called will to power. There's a little published text for that. Most of that is unpublished. I don't take it all that seriously because I don't think Nietzsche was that interested in metaphysics. Metaphysics is trying to say, what's the ultimate constituent of the world? And Nietzsche was he taught us to be suspicious of metaphysics. He says, what is the psychology for wanting to be the ultimate riddler of existence, etc.? He says I think he's better at saying, observe the actual phenomena you can see and try to understand it. Try to understand the psychology behind it. So this idea that he would be involved in an ultimate metaphysics, I find hard to square with the Nietzsche I like, who is so suspicious of this attempt to be what he called the unriddler of the universe, to get to the ultimate nature of reality.
This is probably unrelated to the will to power then, but in some people's minds it may be, but not so sure that it is. But as soon as I started reading Nietzsche as a much younger man, I was struck by some obvious, incredibly motivating kind of language when he talks about the need to take great risks and to face danger. And he has these phrases like build your houses on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius and things like this. And life shouldn't be about self-preservation. This is not how you should live. And this sounds Popperian to me, not in the literal sense, but you should always take great risks with any science should be out there exposed to great risk, which is that element of falsifiability.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I haven't quite put that together, but you're absolutely right that both Popper and Nietzsche think it's important to take risks. And they think it's important not to try to look for evidence for your theory, but try to look for the evidence against your theory. And of course, then who wants to bring down their own theory? But Popper said, well, if you're responsible, you should try to be. You should try. And Nietzsche too. So you're right. They both want to live dangerously. Of course, Popper gets himself into all kind of knots. This is part of my anti-Popperian shtick. But supposing I want to investigate whether all swans are white, and I see 3 swans in this one locale are white. Now, I could go to the next swan in that locale, or I could go to a swan in some different locale. Now, the natural thing you should say is, well, let's go to the other place and see if swans are white there. But according to Popper, we've got no reason not to investigate the swan in the area we've already investigated, because the fact that the first 3 were white gives you no reason to increase the probability that the one you haven't seen in that locale are white. So Popper's own philosophy contradicts his idea that we should take genuine risk, because he sees risk in the wrong place. It'll be in the same place. You may as well sit on your couch and investigate the same thing. So his wider philosophy says take risks and investigate and try to falsify, but his own anti-inductivism actually militates against that. Point not noticed by many philosophers, I might add.
Well, I might make a slight little step in there, because you've done some work on this. So you take the view, it seems that, and you said there as well, that theories can be confirmed. I believe you talk about hypothetical deductivism and things like this, and you think that theories can be confirmed. Correct me if I'm completely wrong about this, but yeah, again, as you mentioned Popper and your criticisms of him, let's jump into those criticisms, because before we get back into Nietzsche and Popper and talk about that, because you've written a lot about induction and the problems with it, and you've written a lot about the possibility of confirmation.
Well, let me give some credit to Popper. I mean, I was brought up by people, Salmon, and I did my PhD under people like Salmon and Clark Glymour, who had no time for Popper because of his anti-inductivism, and I inherited that thought. But to be fair to Popper, Popper did talk about hypothetico-deductivism. And one of the reasons why a lot of scientists like Popper is because his picture of how they work resonates with what they do. That is, Popper says, look, what scientists come up with bold conjectures. God knows where these conjectures come from. Kepler liked the idea of elliptical orbits because he had some weird heretical beliefs about how the ellipse is more perfect than the circle, etc. People come up with weird hypotheses, like all planets travel in elliptical orbits, not circular orbits, for all God knows what reasons. But those are just bold conjectures. The law and order comes in not at the conjecturing part, but in the testing, because you make a conjecture Then you tease out consequences. Like you can say, well, if it travels in an elliptical orbit and it was here in the first month and here in the second month, then in the third month, I'll predict it's here. So you make a prediction, then you check and you get the observation, and then you say, aha, it has passed the test. But here's where I depart from Popper. And here's what most philosophers of science, most actual working scientists don't understand Popper was saying. Popper says, once it's passed the test, you've got no more reason to believe the hypothesis than before it passed the test. Whereas that's not how scientists work. Sure, Popper says, look, just because it passed a test doesn't prove it, but all of us inductivists agree that, just because it passed 10 tests, maybe the 11th test will fail. But what we say is, after teasing out from a hypothesis some observational consequence, if we get that observational consequence, that makes us a little more confirmed in our belief in the hypothesis. We're never conclusively confirmed. Whereas Popper says, no, even after the positive test, you have no more reason to believe it than before the test. And that's just plain crazy. But he is right that the practice of scientists is basically hypothetico-deductivism. They come up with a hypothesis, God knows where it came from. They deduce observational consequences, then they test those, see if those observational consequences are there. The trouble is, what do they do once they've got those observational consequences? They say they feel a bit better, rationally, and rightly so. They feel a bit better about the theory. They have more confidence in it. Popper says their confidence shouldn't increase at all. And that is crazy. And no working scientist recognizes that in their practice.
Do you prefer the phrasing of someone like David Miller, who I know you've written about? And of course, I've got his book on Defense of Critical Rationalism. It's a fantastically dense read. Do you prefer his? Because a lot of what he goes into is simply that perhaps we're all talking about the same thing here. It's just the phrasing that's different. He says, perhaps if we say something like, those repeated instances of induction, they don't get us closer to confirmation. But perhaps what happens then is we simply accept this as true, as a conditional truth, but we accept it. And something, if you can simply twist the language to acceptance,
massive bullshit. Massive bullshit. I'm sorry, I'm just going to be face up. That is a typical evasion. That is a bit of sociology that we accept it. What people, some people accept the earth is flat. Who cares what people accept? What we care about is what we should rationally accept. And what Miller can't do is, Miller is one of these guys, I'm just going to be straight up about this. There's all these cabal of Popperians who want to kind of flatten and not admit the full consequences of his anti-inductivism. So they say, well, after many positive cases, people start accepting a hypothesis. That's just sociology. What they're not allowed to say is it is reasonable of them to accept it, that they have good reason to. Because to say they have good reason is to do induction. So yeah, look, one of the things about Popper, it's so funny and ironical about Popper is he's this guy who emphasizes the critical faculties, but he himself couldn't take criticism. So he had this cabal of philosophers around him. And if anyone said the slightest deviation from the gospel, they were excommunicated. It's like what Spinoza went through, in the Jewish notion, in the Jewish community, they have a herem. Freud was exactly the same. Adler disagreed with him, Jung disagreed with him, excommunicated. Well, all these Popperians were really scared of being excommunicated by the God. And they found devious ways of making the Popperian philosophy look more acceptable. And I don't remember the details too much, but I remember reading Miller and saying, yeah, the typical evasion. He's not willing to say, according to Popper, we have no reason to accept the theory after we've got many positive instances. So he says weasels around it by saying, after many positive instances, people give the theory more acceptance. That's just sociology about what people do. He's evading the issue that according to his own philosophy, they have no reason. It's not reasonable for them to give it more acceptance.
What do you make? No. If you could see this,
I'm just not. I'm old. I didn't care about this bullshit, academic bullshit.
If you could see the smile on my face, Ken. If you could see the smile on my face, Ken. This is interesting. I think this is fantastic and really yeah, please. This is great. I must ask you though on a similar topic on your thoughts on verisimilitude. So this is something else that you've written about verisimilitude and content. And I was wondering this about Nietzsche. We can bridge our way back to Nietzsche from this as well. Perhaps I'm not sure how Nietzsche sees this, but if he's not a greatest fan of an overcommitment to truth, what about a commitment to truth content? Or again, I'm not sure how you see this idea, this concept.
Again, you've got a real philosophical mind. You're pointing out things that communalities I hadn't really thought of. But you're absolutely right that both Popper and Nietzsche care about verisimilitude. They care about getting closer and closer to the truth. Now, because of his anti-inductivism, Popper, there are two things with Popper has problems with verisimilitude. One is because he doesn't believe in induction. It's very hard to see how we're getting closer to the truth, except Popper can say we're ruling out certain theories that have failed, right? But that doesn't mean we're getting closer to the truth. But nevertheless, he valued getting closer to the truth. And also his definition had all these technical difficulties. And actually, one of the things I think is philosophers of science became obsessed with certain technical problems. And I actually think it's because there's a certain, I don't want to say lack of logical acumen, because most of these people were better logicians than I am, but they operated with a kind of defective logic, which is what I tried to repair in my work in logic and philosophy of science. And so there were technical problems with Popper's notion of what it is to get closer to the truth. But I think those technical objections can all be gotten around. And I think there is a sense in which we can say, as we progress, we get closer to the truth. But partly because, we've got more and more evidence for theories, but it's also for what Popper says. We can rule out certain theories. And you're right, yeah, both Nietzsche and Popper have the same attitude is, well, we can't get to the ultimate truth, but we can get closer and closer. And they valued that endeavor.
Let's jump back to Nietzsche then. And you mentioned, I think before we made our divergence there, we spoke about suffering. And that did sound very Popperian to me, this idea that you get life and you get your meaning from suffering itself. And this sounded almost like that, this is very famous quote of Popper. I don't have it in front of me, but I'll paraphrase here. Something like what you should do is find a problem, fall in love with that problem, stick with it, suffer. And when it may breed more problems, in which case you should move on to them. It does sound like a problem-orientated idea of suffering. I wonder if Nietzsche saw something similar to this. Was this meaning to be found in problem solving, or was it to be found in something else?
It's another great communality that I hadn't thought of. Admittedly, I didn't go up this path of looking for communalities, but you're right. They really think problem solving is really important. And, a lot of people, in the inductivist camp, the people who I grew up with in doing my philosophy of science, they'd always make fun of Popper because Popper says, you should be looking for falsifications and you should be happy when you get them. And we used to joke about these people who have some pet theory and that, had been refuted and they held a party and celebrated. It's not like human nature. People are invested in theories and no one likes to see their baby, thrown out. But what I think both Popper and Nietzsche thought they admired people who looked at problems and looked for solutions and were willing to see their own solutions questioned. So problem solving was important to both of them. That's a true point. And they both emphasized the importance of challenging your convictions. And they're both aware it's very comfortable to have convictions. It makes you feel secure in the world, but they thought really great minds challenge convictions and especially challenge their own convictions. Nietzsche had this idea of free spirits, people who put everything up under inquiry, not all at the same time, because then you have no place to stand to do your inquiry, but there's nothing that's sacrosanct. And that Popper and Nietzsche have in common, except Popper thought his own philosophy was sacrosanct. He thought falsification was, people joke about falsification. Well, that's one theory that can never be falsified. Of course, to be fair to Popper, Popper said, look, I'm talking about falsification as a mark of scientificality. My very theory of falsification is not itself a scientific theory. So he didn't think philosophical theories have to be falsifiable in his sense of falsifiable. That is, something is only falsifiable if it clashes with some possible observation sentence. But still, people joke about Popper that he was never willing to see any falsification of his own theory. Nietzsche, I think, was more amenable to seeing his own theories be shot down. Popper demanded absolute devotion, famously.
Now, you mentioned there, this was another I'm not sure how you see this link, but this is probably not a link. This must be a place where the two men violently diverge. If they perhaps agree on the wonderful idea of someone criticizing and trying to challenge as much as they can within society, that's one aspect of Popper's open society as well. They very much diverge on another aspect of that, and that is that everyone gets a voice and that democracy matters. And Nietzsche, again, I'll get you to open this up and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but he seems incredibly, as you mentioned earlier, elitist. He doesn't think people like me should have a voice in the world, or almost everyone shouldn't have a voice in the world. And this is very arrogant quote of his that I know you like to use. I'll say it now. He says, "Let the values of the majority rule in the majority." And he's incredibly dismissive of the idea of letting everyone else in society have a voice and let them drive society through, Popperian piecemeal social engineering.
The actual quote is, "Let the rules of the herd rule in the herd." But there are two. But you're right. The herd is the majority, of course. There are 2 points of that. First of all, let me say the benign point. The benign point goes with his idea that, look, I'm not against Christianity to core. I'm just saying not everyone should be a Christian. He says, look, for some people, Christianity gives meaning to their life. In that sense, all power to it, right? But then he adds a condescending little thing, and these are pretty pathetic people. So there is a nastiness and elitism there. But the anti-democracy, you have to understand, there were a lot of people in the 19th century. There was Taine, there was de Tocqueville, who talked about the tyranny of the majority. There was Nietzsche's colleague, slight mentor, Burckhardt. I wrote about civilization in the Renaissance. And even John Stuart Mill, who in the end was pro-democracy, though a limited form of democracy, were very suspicious of democracy. And why? Because they thought it's part of the coming age of the rule of the herd and of mediocrity. I mean, think what's happening to democracy today, where, you've got a large pool of extremely ignorant people who make up the majority. They thought that democracy is going to usher in a world where all people care about is what Nietzsche called herd happiness, being comfortable, and it would lead to a period of mediocrity. So Nietzsche was part of this 19th century movement that was really suspicious of extreme democracy. Nietzsche saw that engine coming. He said, that train has left the station, it's not going to stop it. And he was very worried about that. But he thought, he didn't want the herd values to be everyone's value. That's why I said, let them have their own values, but let's not all become contaminated by that. So he thought, look, those are individuals who are destined for something beyond the values of the herd, need to be inspired to reach beyond the herd. I don't think he thinks people who are educated like us, that our opinions are valueless. He's really worried about, what is it called? What Hume called the rabble without doors, or the great unwashed, I think. And that might be Hume's expression, or David Stove's, I've forgotten which. But a lot of these 19th century people, remember, Tocqueville, tyranny of the majority, was really, really worried about plebeian taste that would just be concerned with, very base happiness and consumerism, as we might call it today. And that was Nietzsche's worry.
Do you think he was perhaps missing, this is interesting to me, do you think perhaps he was missing staring at the mess of societies today and democracy and the animosity and all that appeal to the lowest common denominator and the baseness of it? Do you think he was perhaps missing that underlying it all was a type of error correction going on, a messy error correction, but a slow and steady creation of new Nietzschean values through a sort of undercurrent of criticism that perhaps is lost, a lot less prominent to people's eyes, simply because it's just not as attractive and as the mess of it all. It's easier to say it's just distraction and mess and fighting without realizing that there's perhaps some progress happening here too.
Well, let me twist your point in a different way, but I think it's in the same direction. And it's actually part of Richard Rorty's criticism, implicit criticism of Nietzsche. He said, look, let's say Nietzsche, I agree with you that great creative individuals are incredibly valuable, etc. Maybe are not the be-all and end-all that you make of them, but I still think they're very valuable. Well, what's better than liberal democracy to allow a freedom and space for great individuals to arise? What are you suggesting, Nietzsche? You're saying going back to autocracy, dictator, what? And, this is one of the really disappointing features of Nietzsche. He gives us no positive politics, no positive sense of what society as a political entity could be in order to foster his very ends. He became just suspicious of politics generally, and he just aimed to inspire a few individuals. But, Rorty's point stands that, liberal democracy it might be one of the best ways of breeding actual individuals because it gives so great freedom. And also think back to Nietzsche's, bitching about Christianity. All the people he really valued came from basically Christian society. He knows very little about Asia. That's part of his ignorance. But, who does he value? People like Beethoven, people like Goethe, people like Nietzsche. They were really inspired, even if they're contrary in Nietzsche's case, they were inspired by Christianity. The Christian world gave rise, the Judeo-Christian world in the West gave rise to the very creative people that Nietzsche so values. So, there's a point to be made against Nietzsche that, he rails against democracy, he rails against Christianity, but he loves creative people. Well, maybe Christianity provided conditions for great creative people, and maybe democracy does. So that's a fault line in Nietzsche's philosophy, I think. I think his real worry is that, what's coming is a demand for uniformity, for everyone aiming for just mere contentment, people aiming for comfortable lives. And he thinks that is now Christian values are being realized to a certain extent. They're making for a world of mediocrity. It's one of the most interesting points that while he rails against Christianity, he actually thinks Christianity only really exists in the 19th century in the following sense. Christianity as dogma, all that ontology of God and souls, that existed for thousands of years. But Christianity preached values like the value of compassion, and every voice must be heard. Every voice is a creation of God. Every voice is valuable. Christianity preached that, but they didn't practice it. Were the popes in Rome practicing that kind of compassion? Actually, Christian values are being implemented in the 19th century by a bunch of atheists, because they're the ones, the socialists and the communists, etc., were saying, the Democrats are saying every voice must be heard. So the funny thing and the ironic thing is Christian values, which have been preached for thousands of years, only get realized, and they get realized mainly by a bunch of atheists in the 19th century. And you think that is leading to the world of mediocrity.
Let me contort myself a little bit here, trying to make it perhaps some interesting allusions between the two men here. Nietzsche speaks about these great men driving us forward, and he speaks about the need for myth to add meaning to people's lives. Now, where does he get those two ideas from? Because it sounds, I can imagine Popper being quite upset about both of them. He would think they're both inductivist claims. Perhaps he's looking at history and saying it has been traditionally great men driving us forward. It has traditionally been myth and the opposite of truth that has been given us meaning in our lives. But that does not mean that that's the only place that progress and meaning can come from in the future.
Can you tell me where else might meaning come
you could perhaps, if we stick to something like meaning, you could perhaps separate it. So you could ask why Christianity gave people meaning, for example, and you may get something like a whole series of claims about this. It's good to make progress. It's good to suffer and overcome yourself. It's good to, a number of reasons that you may actually have an answer to that. And you can then attach that to a truth and explain that to someone and say, if you don't do these things in your life, you will lose meaning. As in, there must be a reason for those myths to have to hand over meaning to people, and can't we extract that reason and just explain it to people?
I think we can give a causal story, not a reason. You can give a causal story about why people believe in witches, but you're not saying there are good reasons to believe in witches. Well, I think, evolution and it kind of, group evolution was a notion that was around from Darwin, and Nietzsche was ballparked there. And I don't say Nietzsche says it, but it's a Nietzschean thought to say that we've been selected towards having a need towards meaning, in the sense that a group that looks for common meaning is a group that has closer bonds. And those closer bonds will increase its survival prospects. That is, groups that are only loosely affiliated don't do as well as groups in primitive times, groups that are tightly affiliated, because if you're tightly affiliated, you're willing to fight and die for each other. If you're loosely affiliated, you might say, what's in it for me? So you can think of evolution has given us this need to, for instance, search for meaning, because meaning is one of the things that make for group bonding. So that would be an evolutionary account. I don't say Nietzsche gives this account, but it's a very Nietzschean kind of account. So there's be an evolutionary account of why we have a need for meaning. But the interesting thing is that's just a causal account of it. Nietzsche actually turns it into something normative. That is, for him, it's moral. Nietzsche thinks we should, not that we tend to want to find meaning, but we should want to find meaning. And the reason he thinks we should want to find meaning is because he makes his own God, and his God is these great creative people, high culture. Nietzsche has his own little religion going. That is the religion of creativity and great individuals. But those are his values, and he knows they're his values, and he realizes they're not binding on other people. But then he says, so you're not bound by them, but I hope to inspire other people with real talent, to be bound by these values. So Nietzsche can give you can give a Nietzschean causal story about why we value meaning, but Nietzsche says, no, I don't want to just give a story about why we value meaning. I think we should value meaning, because otherwise we are small and pathetic. But that shows you his values. His values is he doesn't like the small and pathetic. He likes the grand and brilliant.
Why does that meaning have to come from a master narrative in Nietzschean terms? Why? I imagine a lot of people listening to this will think, why do we need a master narrative to give meaning? Why can't we just? I imagine a lot of people would think the meaning I get in my lives doesn't come from an overarching narrative. It comes from the small things I do every day, from raising my children or loving my wife.
That's last man territory.
Oh, really?
That's Nietzsche's worry. Yeah, I worry about my children and their careers, my corner office, my good meals. I say this as someone who's obsessed with food. Anyhow, so I'm setting myself up to a certain extent. The point is that Nietzsche thinks if you don't tell one of those big master narratives, then you'll end up having these kind of very personal values that turn you into a last man, that make you kind of pathetic and self-serving. He says somewhere in the essay on Wagner that he's got, I don't know where it's in, Untimely Meditations, or maybe it's the essay on Schopenhauer in that same book, that every person needs to be consecrated to something beyond themselves. Now, he doesn't mean this is a proven fact. It's his idea. It's the world he wants. The world he wants people to be consecrated to something beyond themselves. I mean, that's a part of him that's religious, because he thinks otherwise we're pathetic animals. I'm kind of somewhat sympathetic to that. But, as I say, that's really Nietzsche's religious beliefs. But it's religion that, he knows it's his personal mythology.
As we run out of time a little bit here, let's talk about some of the challenges of providing meaning here. I might talk about the current moment for a bit, and we can add some of those thoughts there as well. So I know you've spoken a bit, and we chatted a bit before this about politics. And let's talk about the rise of something like Donald Trump in America, or at least political movements similar to it. And people listening may say, well, this sounds Nietzschean to me. This is an idea that we can't trust truth. That as we covered, that's not what Nietzsche says. But the idea that truth is not the most valuable thing. It's about meaning. It's about addressing suffering and giving value to people's suffering. And someone like Trump can come along and deny truth and to say, well, this is where your meaning can come from. And he gives the grand narrative, or perhaps this kind of example would simply back up Nietzsche if you saw it and say that's exactly the point. Someone can come along and manipulate you in this way unless you create your own master narrative.
That's exactly right. We were talking about this earlier before the official interview, but that's Nietzsche is so clever in that, claiming that what man needs is meaning. Man is more interested in having meaning in the life than having a comfortable life, and that is something the left completely lost. Look, I despise both Trump and our English Prime Minister Boris Johnson. They're both opportunists, but what they onto in an instinctive animal way, I don't think they theorized it out, is that people care about rhetorics of meaning. Look what Johnson, see, the people who will remain, they just treated us as homo economicus. Remember, economics, that is, wealth is, something that's measurable and to stand in for happiness. The idea is the more wealth you have, the more happy you are. People can question that. But anyhow, wealth is just a stand-in for happiness. And they're saying, look, if you stay in Europe, you'll be happier. You'll have more wealth, in other words. So they treated us as just calculators of wealth. Whereas what Johnson did is he provided rhetorics of meaning. I mean, he said he didn't say you'll be poorer, because that's not a great sales pitch, but he emphasized other values, your identity values, our Britishness, our right to self-determination, our sense of a unified people, etc., not being rootless cosmopolitans. So he realized people cared about their identities. And he'd say, I will give you back your identity, right? And that appealed to people. And Trump did exactly the same. The left had devolved, especially both under Blair in England and under Clinton's in the US, and saying, oh, we're just going to be better managers and we'll help your economic well-being. And they left the field of meaning to these populists. So people like Trump, I think it's a crap identity, but it's still an identity that people care about. Our religion, not that he cares about religion, but he pretends to care. Our religion, our guns, our Americanness, our whiteness. He appealed to their sense of identity, saying, look, I'm going to help you reclaim your identity. We're going to be working together actively as part of a unit who has a sense of self-identity that we're working to further and trying to defeat these allegedly destructive elements. Whereas all the left could do is talk about how you'll be economically better off under us. And so the left just vacated the field of meaning and left it to the right. Whereas the old left, the left of the times in America of Dewey and people like that, they very much were a left of identity. They used to have left of workers' film clubs, May Day parades, marches, unionization. They said, we're fighting for social justice. We're all active in it together. So they tried to give the working class a sense of communal identity through this aim of together working for social justice. Whereas this new left, the people, the Clintons and the Blairs of the world, they say, yeah, well, the poor, the working class, they're just bloody idiots. And we middle class out of our largesse will help them. That gave them a very positive identity because we're these middle class, saints. But the working class they were meant to be, sympathetic towards are just seen as passive recipients of their largesse, giving them no positive identity. So then the right steps in and says, no, we're giving you a positive identity. You're fighting for our guns and our nation and all this kind of crap. So, if they would be a bit more Nietzschean, the left would have realized people need to have a sense of meaning in their lives. The right is providing this, I think that's bullshit meaning, but they're at least in the meaning game. And so much of the left for a long time vacated the realm of meaning. And that was a disaster for the left. They should have been more Nietzschean.
Yeah, that is such an interesting thing. I haven't asked you yet, and I should have asked you a lot earlier. A lot of people listening to this will have this idea in their minds that Nietzsche is a kind of relativist then. And I think you've answered that an awful lot so far, but I might get to touch on that because I know a lot of people, whenever you talk about Nietzsche, they will bring up this idea, well, he's simply a relativist then. And I know you rail against this both personally and on behalf of Nietzsche.
No, Nietzsche thinks he's got the psychology right, and someone who's got a different psychology saying, no, the Christians are full of love for their fellow man from the get-go. I was like, that's just psychologically unastute and wrong. He thinks there is truth. Look, what he's a relativist about is values. That is, he thinks some values, look, as he said, Christian values can be perfectly good for certain people. He thinks they're very weak people. And that's the condescending part. So he's a relativist he's not a relativist about truth, about whether to say, it's not a relativist about whether there's a computer in front of me. Nietzsche would say, if he had the terminology, It's a fact that there's a computer and there's nothing relative about that. He is a relativist about values in the sense that he thinks what is valuable for others can be poisonous to others. Like he thinks Christianity can be poisonous to potentially great men if it gets them obsessed with the problem of alleviating suffering. No, they should forget about suffering and they should even embrace suffering to further their talents. But for other people, weaker people, maybe being concerned with the problem of suffering is the best life they can have. So Nietzsche is a relativist about values to a certain extent. What is valuable for someone else, for one person, might not be valuable for another, meaning what is a good form of life for someone might be not a good form of life for another person. But he's not a relativist about scientific truth or objective truths about observation.
Even in terms of value, as you're speaking there, I was thinking, so if he says, the values of the herd, you can have these values, they may bring you happiness and meaning. I'm assuming he wouldn't say, though, that those values are equal to this master narrative that he's hoping his Übermensch will create.
Well, no, I don't think he'd say they're equal, but he wouldn't say they're unequal. He'd avoid that terminology. He's like a doctor. He's trying to diagnose sickness. And he says, look, what is medicine for some, and he actually literally says this in The Gay Science, what is medicine for some is poison for others. So he just doesn't, the equality doesn't enter into it because he thinks diagnostically. He thinks, what is this person's sickness? What will help them? What is that person's sicknesses? And different of us suffer different sicknesses and there are different cures for them. So that's one of the things he's against. Actually, I think Popper would like this part too, that he's against a very easy universal generalization and thinks we've got to question those generalizations and look for more specific answers.
So what would happen if someone who is not in his elite few, his Übermensch, tried to adopt the values of such a master narrative? What sort of damage would be done to their lives?
Well, there are all these films that explore exactly that. Hitchcock in Rope, these two boys decide to murder an innocent person just to prove that they're above, herd morality. And in fact, I think by the end of Nietzsche's life, they were already in Germany. People always think about, the Leopold and Loeb murders, the famous ones in America, where were inspired by Nietzschean style thought. Actually, one of them may have actually read Nietzsche, as far as I remember. That's what Rope is really based on, where they just murder someone not for any real motive except to say that they're beyond herd conventional Judeo-Christian morality. But way before then, there were tons of Nietzsche murder cases where people took inspiration from Nietzsche. Nietzsche actually said at one point, terrible things will be done in my name. And Nietzsche realized that certain idiots will read Nietzsche and misappropriate him, but he was totally irresponsible and he didn't give a damn about them. There's all this stuff about, the Nazis appropriating Nietzsche, which they did. And then, a lot of Nietzscheans try to defend Nietzsche by saying, oh, but the Nazis weren't for individualism. They were for regimentation, everyone working, walking in lockstep, etc. Yeah, but, the important point is that Nietzsche really, railed against compassion. And the Nazis did learn that from Nietzsche and other sources that, they learned to be, Nietzsche was part of a rhetoric in the 19th century that taught people to be suspicious of compassion. And when people are suspicious of compassion, sometimes they do horrible things. Nietzsche was just completely irresponsible. He didn't care what idiots did with his thoughts. He just cared about the elite. And that's kind of part of the horribleness of Nietzsche. He realized that idiots could misinterpret him. Because, when Nietzsche's talking about stop being obsessed with suffering, he said, stop being obsessed with your own suffering and, try to make something of your life, even if that involves suffering. He's not saying try to impose suffering on others. He does say that sometimes alleviating other people's suffering isn't always the right thing to do because they might need to suffer in order to realize their dreams, etc. The guy who's climbing the mountain, you don't want to just whisk him up on a helicopter and take him up there. It might alleviate a lot of suffering, but it defeats his aim of achieving something. But Nietzsche wasn't into wholesale making other people suffer, the way the Nazis did or whatever. But nevertheless, the fact that he disvalued compassion makes him a contributing cause to horrible events in the 20th century. Because if you teach people to disvalue compassion, it can have horrible consequences. He just didn't care.
Well, I might, as we come to an end here, I might touch on that with a quote from yourself, which I found interesting in one of your articles, and it says, "Sometimes it seems as if Nietzsche is dangling a Faustian bargain before our eyes. Would you be willing, indeed, maybe even happy, to endure suffering and cruelty in order to achieve great heights? Or would you prefer a peaceful world of general contentness brought at the price of general mediocrity?" And so is that the Faustian bargain that he is dangling before us?
I said that?
Yes, yes, you did.
I have a memory problem, so I often have to ask people, did I say that? So it's not an uncommon experience. Yeah, that's not badly written.
No, not bad at all.
Yeah. Well, he wants you to take, look, the idea is, for most people, they shouldn't take that Faustian bargain because it'll just make them miserable and they won't be particularly creative. The trouble is that norm of not taking the Faustian bargain, of taking terrible risks, is now meant to be the norm for everybody, just like Christianity. Christianity, what it aspired to be is it's an evangelical religion. It wants to be the religion for everyone. Everyone has to have those values. Well, Nietzsche is not saying everyone has to make the Faustian bargain of taking terrible risks, but he thinks those who are generally talented, need to be inspired by texts like Nietzsche to take those terrible risks and let the herd, avoid risk, because risk-taking won't do them much good anyhow. So not everyone takes the Faustian bargain. Those who should, so to speak.
Last question. I might end where we really must with Nietzsche, and that is the place that Nietzsche sits within the world of philosophy. And there was that quote earlier, some people are born posthumously, and it has never been truer than with someone like Nietzsche, who he seems to be getting more and more popular as the years go by. I'm a big fan of Popper. I think he got a lot right, but he certainly doesn't seem to be becoming more and more popular as the years go by. Nietzsche, on the other hand, is skyrocketing every time, and some of this perhaps has got to do with the way he writes. He doesn't write like a philosopher. He's with wonderful bombast, and he's the most quotable person you're ever going to touch. But there's more to this, I think. I'm not sure how you see it yet. You mentioned earlier that change you made in your own life from philosophy of science to Nietzsche. Nietzsche's philosophy, it seems, it's personal to everyone who picks up the book. It seems to touch some people in really personal ways. And as I read him again this week and, trying to plan this out and think about the contrast with the philosophy of science, I was struck by the difference that Nietzsche does what no other philosophy really can do or has done. He really shakes you awake and wakes up philosophy and gets you standing and the hairs on your arms up, and you are awake and you're live to the world of philosophy for once. So I wonder how you see it and what the future of Nietzsche is going to be.
Well, I do think if you bought Nietzsche shares, you're doing well. If you bought Popper shares, it's a down market. Yes. But seriously, I think the point is, look, there are two things going on. One of them we've been speaking about. That is, Nietzsche is really talking about a central problem of our time. That is that our will to truth has led to to nihilism, to an absence of meaning, to a disenchanting of the world. And we find that very hard to live with, possibly because we've been evolutionarily selected to want to find meaning in the world. That's the point about group selection. But there's another point, and you touched upon the point. And it's a point that Nietzsche writes in this incredibly bombastic, rhetorically loaded way. But there's a point behind this, because Nietzsche thinks, and here again, he shares something with Schopenhauer and Freud. They think our reasons are basically post hoc. That is, we alight on certain political beliefs and moral beliefs, actually for certain what we call emotional or affective reasons. Affective has to do with our passions. And then later on, we come up with after the fact rationalizations. So that's one of the reasons. Nietzsche doesn't give a lot of reasons. He does have reasons for a lot of his positions, but he doesn't stress the reason so much, but rather he tries to manipulate your affective engagement. Like, I mentioned already before that he tries to tar Christianity with Judaism in his German audience's mind, because he thinks, giving them reasons against Christianity, that's not going to move them. He thinks reasons are post hoc rationalizations for views we take because of our affective emotional orientation. So he appeals to us emotionally. He tries to manipulate our emotions because that way he thinks he can tar certain ideas he thinks are pernicious, like Christianity, with kind of negative effects, like making it look deceitful and manipulative and people just looking after themselves and pretending they're looking after the greater interest of others, etc. So he makes it try to look ugly and self-serving, making it look almost disgusting, because he often uses the rhetoric of disgust because he thinks that's what really moves us. And that's why he's so different from other philosophers, because all other philosophers pride themselves on appealing to our reason. Whereas Nietzsche says, no, I'm not going to appeal to your reason because I want to be effective. And to be effective, the reasons will wash by you. If you're effectively wedded to an opinion, reason isn't really going to move you. Okay, this might be less true when it comes to scientific theories, because scientific theories can be moved by evidence, etc. You know, Kuhn and others said it's not such a straightforward game that the evidence comes clearly and the theory is refuted, but still, science is moved by evidence in certain ways. But at the level of, Nietzsche is really concerned with our values. He's fundamentally a philosopher of values. And values, he says, we alight on for effective reasons because they chime with the way we've been educated, to the way we've seen positive and negative valences, etc. And you change people's ethical orientation by changing their affective, emotional, passionate resonances, not by reasoned argument, which is why he's such a bloody effective writer, because he appeals to us at an effective level.
I must ask you though, then, Ken, as you're saying that, just one last little snippet here. What is the emotional resonance that he gives to you? Because I know a lot of people will read Nietzsche and I always get two things. One, they come away feeling incredibly motivated to do great things, or often they come away incredibly depressed, realizing they don't live up to Nietzsche's high standards. So what does Nietzsche do to you personally?
Bit of both. I had a pretty bad upbringing in the sense that my dad's implicitly said, he never said this explicitly, that the only people who count were, Freud and Hermann Hesse. That's a pretty bad choice there. Thomas Mann and those people. Not that he was any of them himself, which I put together by the age of 12. Well, if you value these people, who the hell are you? It's not a very healthy value to have. Unfortunately, I have a bit of those values. And look, of myself personally, the distance between Nietzsche, or say Kant, who's also a total bloody genius, the distance between Nietzsche and Kant and me is like the distance between me and a dog. So, I don't mean to put myself down. I think I write pretty well in my philosophy. I'm pretty good at writing in the genres I write. But the difference between people like me, a good philosophy professor, and, complete geniuses like Kant and Nietzsche, they're just a different ballpark. So it is a bit depressing. But I, unfortunately, nevertheless, I guess because of my affective orientation, because I love my dad so much, have some of that valuing of really creative individuals. It doesn't make me feel great about myself all the time. But, one thing I console myself with is I say geniuses, there's a conceptual space, what Wilfrid Sellers called the space of reasons. Geniuses like Kant and Nietzsche and Descartes map out whole regions of that space. Ordinary philosophers like me, we get a few alleys and, we map out a few little avenues, etc. But at least I'm doing some of the mapping.
Well, as I said before, I had paid attention to your Nietzsche mapping before this, and I've never heard Nietzsche expressed in such fun and interesting terms. And it's been a rare pleasure for me to be able to speak with you, Ken. I must apologize, though, for not being able to include as much of your own philosophy of science that we dipped into there. But I'm going to link below the article, below the podcast, a handful of your articles on that. So if people have the mathematical skills and and know-how, then they can go there and dip into those things and dig out and think about those things in the ways that we should have and had time for in this podcast. But again, Ken, it's been such a rare pleasure and such an enjoyable podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on the Popperian Podcast.
Thanks, dude. I want to thank you, Jed. You asked great question. And you actually made me think on my feet about the similarities between Popper and Nietzsche, which is something new to me. So I thank you for that.